on the ground, and of course, in due course, we shall be, or they shall be, filing an appropriate report in regard to that meeting. Well, these are some of the issues that we are tracking, and of course, now we're back in studio. Our conversation this morning is on the African Climate Summit that birthed the Nairobi Declaration on Climate Change and Action and Call to Action. We are in the company of Charles Mwangi, who is the head of programs at the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. He's helping us to break down the Nairobi Declaration, the hit and the misses. Well, before we went for that briefing there by the head of public service, we were talking about some of the issues that were highlighted, and one of them you talked about the fact that in a continent whereby you have 1.2 billion people, 600 million or half of those people, they do not have access to electricity. And when you look at investment in renewable energy, you're talking about $63 billion in a continent where you have about 54 countries, and this is in comparison to the $3 trillion worth of investment in renewable energy. And so the question is then, how then Africa can raise its voice, and not just its voice, but also to ensure that there are concrete actions to increase investment in renewable energy in Africa?
Thank you so much, Brian. And energy is a very, very important element in redeeming this continent from the climate crisis we are in. Because access to energy will guarantee, jobs for our people, in terms of young people who are going to self-employ themselves, through various, business, initiatives that, of course, will require energy, welding, and so on and so forth. Yeah. But the biggest challenge we have in the continent, like I did mention, is that there are three important factors when you're talking about energy. There is access, there is reliability of that energy, and there is also affordability of that energy. Yeah. The fact that electricity line passes near your home does not necessarily mean that you have access to that power. Yeah. And the fact that that power is connected to you does not necessarily mean it's actually reliable. And again, it goes now on to say the question of affordability. How affordable is our energy? And as we think about calling upon investors to also come and invest in Africa, and that's what the president has been also focusing on, saying that, hey, look here, you can also come and take advantage of our clean energy and probably invest here. But how reliable is that energy, and how, of course, affordable is that particular energy? So we need to be very careful about then how we even tax energy. If you look at you're talking, for example, the amount of money that you actually pay in tax, as you buy those particular tokens, is quite, massive. So you have to look at the tax regime and how we address that. But there's also the question of who owns the energy. When we talk about the monopoly that, for example, we have in Kenya, KBC has been a monopoly, in energy, for example. But how do we make it easy, for other investors to also produce energy and sell to the national grid? If we can actually make that easy, that possible, we facilitate, that. And I think the leaders in Africa, the heads of state, also committed that they are going to work on policies, that are going to ensure that we have, policies that are actually friendly to green growth. And I think we need to address energy in the first place, to ensure that we have investors coming in to invest in energy, but also making sure that energy is affordable, is accessible, and it's also reliable.
And also help us understand here, I mean, you see, why is it a problem for Europe, for North America, for China, that 600 million Africans do not have access to electricity? How is it their problem? I mean, is it not up to African countries to ensure that their population or its population has access to electricity?
Yes, of course, it remains, a primary role of the African governments to ensure that they invest heavily in energy, and energy that's going to spur growth. But again, remember, energy is also a very big factor when it comes to the conversion around climate change. Why? Because of course, our approach in terms of using coal, fossil fuels, to generate, power, and so on and so forth. And we've been talking about transitioning and moving to clean energy sources. And Africa, the beauty of it is that we are endowed with all these resources, like I was mentioning.
But they're expensive.
The good thing, At least we have solar, for example. We have wind. We have not even exploited in Kenya, for example, 10% of our geothermal potential. But you see, those natural resources will only remain as natural resources. But without technologies to exploit them, they remain useless.
Do we have the technology?
That is a big question. And one of the conversations we've been having at the global stage is how do we ensure this technology transfer? From where this technology is, to Africa, to help us in terms of, exploiting some of these energy potential that we have in the continent, but also to be able to address the question of climate change and adaptation, for our people. And I think that is a big challenge because this technology transfer is not happening. You get the point. But I think we also need to invest also in research in the continent of Africa. We need to actually come up with our own endogenous research and come up with technologies and support those of us that are doing some good work. There's one professor in Cameroon, in one of the universities, who is actually really reading, the process of coming up with very simple technologies, for harvesting solar and so on and so forth. And some of those initiatives, and I think in Kenya we also have the same. We even have institutions that are actually focusing on, research in the same. We need to invest so much in research. I think we are doing not very well in terms of how we invest in research, so that we can also come up with our own homemade technologies, even as we continue pushing the North to actually transfer technologies that we need for us to be able to exploit this. Because when they come from outside, they're also quite expensive. The machineries and so on and so forth are quite expensive, and that also makes our energy expensive in the long run.
I mean, look, I think, at some point we like to direct our problems to where they are not supposed to be directed. Because, I mean, look, when you look at Africa, on average, Africa has been independent for more than 60 years now. Most African countries, they got their independence from their colonizers, in the 60s. And when you look at the African continent, I mean, you still have about 600 million people, without access to electricity. You still have about 400 million people without access to safe drinking water. You still have another 700 million people without access to proper sanitation. Should we be bringing this issue to the world's attention? I mean, I thought this is our own problem we need to deal with. We need to create strategies on how to deal with these. Why should it become a global issue, honestly?
Thank you so much, Brian. And like I did mention, it's primarily, our own African, issue that we need to address. Of course, support is still needed from the West. That is still needed. But we have to also think internally how we approach our issues. The head of public service has just talked about issues of corruption within government, parastatals and departments. And until we stem out some of those, systemic challenges we have within our systems, we will always be going around in circles. So we need to be more efficient in terms of how we utilize our resources. We must stem out corruption within the government systems. But again, we must also, enhance, our use of domestic resources and appropriating those resources, in the right manner. Right now, we have the devolved, system of governance. How well are we supporting the counties, in terms of rolling out some of these, issues that we need to roll out at the very local level, because we really have to localize, our approach. Even climate response is about really localizing, our interventions to ensure that services reach the common, people, the common people at the front end of the climate crisis. So we need to deal with those systemic, challenges. But again, we need to have long-term planning, long-term plans, that also responsive to the needs of our people. But the challenge with our governance is the fact that when I come to power, what I want to do is to trash whatever plans that everybody else, had come up with. And I want to come up with new, magical ideas, And then, of course, we leave, whatever probably had actually been initiated. If we can be very, consistent and systematic in terms of how, we plan our development. And it's clear because we have, counties have their CIDPs, county development, plans, for example. We have our blueprints, we have, for example, our NDCs, our National Determined Contribution, document, which is a good blueprint that touches on the sectors that you actually did mention, transport, energy, and so on and so forth. And it has very clear, plans on how then we need to address this. But I think one challenge we have is that we have good policies, but when it comes in now translating those policies into implementation of the ground, we fail terribly. And that's a very big problem. So you really have to connect, our policies with implementation plans and, of course, resources that goes into supporting implementation of such plans.
And I like that you're bringing in the issue of planning, because as part of the declaration was the fact that, the conference raised the concern that, urbanization in Africa is rapidly growing, and our cities, are under huge pressure from, the huge rural to urban migration. And, according to estimates, urban centers and cities in Africa, they accommodate about 1 billion people. Now, without proper planning, this is expected to be a big problem. So then how do we inculcate a culture of planning, a culture of ensuring that we come up with sustainable planning methods? Because, you go to some of the cities in Europe, you realize that their plannings were done more than 2,000 years ago. You go, for example, to Rome, you discover that the infrastructure there was planned more than 1,000 years, and it is still working. But when you come to Africa, we don't have those kind of plans. Do we really need the West to come and help us, in planning our cities, honestly?
That's a good question. In fact, we are getting urbanized at a very, very high rate. Actually, by 2050, like you did mention, more than 1 billion people will be living in the cities in the continent of Africa. But at the moment, we're already struggling, with a lot of infrastructure challenges. Talk about transport infrastructure, talk about especially, water infrastructure. We hardly have enough water in Nairobi. Even with the population that we have at the moment, and so is the case with many particular cities, and therefore we must act quickly. We must think very, very, we must be very decisive in terms of how we plan, and planning, thinking about the increasing population, because our population is projected to continue increasing, in the continent of Africa. Actually, this is where population will continue increasing even as other areas remain stagnant or probably going down, and we must be very decisive in terms of how we do this. But like I did mention, these cities are now located in the counties. At the moment, we are working with the United Cities and Local Governments Authority, institution, that is working, with the cities and municipalities across Africa in ensuring that we build, resilient, cities, across the continent. But I think this, as much as possible, has to be a devolved, function. We must empower, our subnational jurisdictions, our subnational, governments. In Kenya, for example, we are talking about county governments. In other regions, it could be a different arrangement. But I think we must really embrace local level action and put enough resources. How much money are we giving to the counties, for example? Right now, like I say, we are talking about El Nino. And El Nino is likely to destroy, road infrastructure, water infrastructure, the sewer infrastructure. In Nairobi, we saw what happened when we had flooding the other day. A lot of challenges, that come with the same. So, but how do we support our local governments, our county governments, to ensure that they have enough resources to be able to put some of these particular measures in place? But how do you also enhance, also revenue collection, at that particular level to ensure that these counties are also self-sustaining in one way or the other? I think that is quite critical. But again, the other issue is that we also need to see a lot of harmony within how governments, institutions works. At the moment, we're seeing a lot of silo, mentality in terms of how you address issues. So the environment ministry is thinking on one side, but again, whatever they're doing is not necessarily connected with the Ministry of Health, for example. We did pose a question to the ministers of health in a convening we had at the Africa Climate Summit, discussing health and climate change. And we did ask the ministers who had attended that particular meeting, how many of the ministers of health are actually involved within the climate change committees within their governments. And you realize there are very few that are, in that particular committee, for example. When we've been discussing AMSEN, Africa Ministerial Conference on Environment, where the environment ministers come and meet and, of course, they discuss matters, climate change. One of the questions that we did ask is, a lot of issues that they raised are that we need resources to be able to implement plans that they have, on environment. But you see, the African ministers also meet. The finance ministers also meet in their own forum. For example, at what point do we connect, these conversations, between the ministers of finance, the ministers of environment, the ministers of health, and indeed all those other ministries, of course, within the continent. So we need to see a lot of harmony in terms of how governments work and how, of course, planning happens, so that we think as one, because one ministry has an impact on the other in terms of how then we connect our operations.
As part of the declaration, there was a clarion call that rich nations should honor their commitment to provide $100 billion in annual climate financing, which was one of the promises made in 2009 during the Copenhagen talks. And 2009, are we in 2024? Clearly, should we still be waiting for the $100 billion? I mean, by now, we should know that this is not likely to happen, and or if it is happening, then it is happening in other way, and craft a strategy of moving forward. Should we still be talking about the West or the rich countries honoring their commitment today?
I think that is one narrative that we must not really, forget. It's a narrative that we must continue, advancing, because, like I did mention, the principle of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities, that must really be upheld. They have emitted more, so they need to give more. 20%, about 20 countries are responsible for 80% of the emissions, but they also control 80% of the GDP, global GDP.
Yeah.
So the resources are there. If there's a political commitment, if there's only that political commitment to actually avail resources, I think that can actually be able to can actually happen. But 14 years down the line, we haven't seen much. Even here in Nairobi, we had a lot of commitments, declarations and announcements, but that remains, those remains just declarations. We need to see, those resources actually flowing. But more importantly, we need to look at the current, state of negotiations. We have what we're calling NCQG, New Collective and Quantified Finance Goal. It's a new goal altogether that is being discussed, and I think we need to be more decisive in terms of how then we arrive, at a goal, that is acceptable to all. Remember, even the 100 billion was not based on anything. It was just but a political statement, a feel-good sort of statement. It was not informed by actual needs of the people. Like I did mention, adaptation alone has a gap of 340 billion per year by 2030. Now, even this 100 billion, even if it was availed, that cannot be able to bridge, that particular gap. And notwithstanding the fact that it's never even saw the light of the day. We are discussing about doubling of adaptation finance. And those are commitments, of course, taken by developed countries in the previous in Glasgow, and we needed to see a lot of commitment in terms of then how that doubling happens. But again, we are saying even doubling may not take us where we are supposed to be, but at least it will be some progress towards that direction. We are now discussing global goal for adaptation, which has been a discussion that that has gathered pace, and really it is really gaining traction. But in the conversations around the same, and you were in Germany during the SB 58, where there were conversations around the same. You realize that when it comes to means of implementation and coming up with a framework for the global goal of adaptation, the conversation around the means of implementation sometimes brings a lot of back and forth and a tug of war. Because means of implementation means that we have to avail resources to ensure that this particular goal, of course, is achieved. And we need to be clear in terms of how then are we going to operationalize this framework and in terms of the resources and so on and so forth. And that has been a very, very big bottleneck. So what you're calling for is a political commitment by developed country partners to make sure that at least they honor what they commit. Commit, but then at least honor. Doubling of adaptation finance, at least let's see some progress towards that direction. We have now loss and damage facility established, but how long are we going to take in terms of now making sure it is operationalized, making sure it is well resourced? Remember, when we got a decision on adaptation finance, it took, or adaptation fund, so to say, it took 7 years between the time that decision was arrived at and when it was actually operationalized. So are we going to see the same trend with the loss and damage facility, or are we going to see something different? One thing, however, that we need to be careful about is that we need to be careful about procedures and proposals that also commercialize climate change. Now, loss and damage conversation is now gravitating towards conversion around insurance. Now, this insurance, is it in any way going to have a net positive effect in Africa? Or are we going to have a net, oozing of resources from the continent? Because these insurance companies, of course, will be based from, somewhere. The resources, of course, will be controlled by a certain particular probably company, which is probably not Africa. And we will be forced, of course, now to insure our people against some of these particular impacts. So it's going to be business. The carbon thing, which has become a big, big debate again, it's being proposed as a mechanism through which Africa can be able to get resources to support adaptation. In other words, this challenge is actually being taken back to us. That, you know what, work in terms of making sure that you support adaptation. But the net effect again of carbon trade, does it support Africa, or are we, losing, in terms of whatever resources come through and the investment that we put into the same.
And so when you look at the Nairobi Declaration, it is full of we urge, we request, we commit. But is there anything else that can be done beyond that? Because when you go through that document, and there are about 67 points, 65 points in that document, you see a lot of pleas from Africa to the West that please contribute more towards our water sustainability project, contribute more to renewable energy, contribute more to futuristic planning. I mean, you don't hear concrete conclusions from the African governments that we are going to commit this so much resources towards doing ABCD, and this is going to be our performance tracking mechanisms. That one is missing out. So how do we track performance of ourselves as Africa?
That's a very, very big, actually that's $1 million question, Brian. And I remember when we went for AMSEN in Addis Ababa, just before the start of the Africa Climate Summit, we had a meeting for the major groups. And one of the issues that we were looking at were how AMSEN, Africa Ministerial Conference of Environment, how decisions, are pushed. And we said there have been a lot of decisions within that particular conference or that particular framework. But you see, implementation is actually almost zero. Nothing much has actually happened. And one of the issues that we also raised is the fact that if you look at the declaration that comes from the AMSEN, from the Africa Ministerial Conference on Environment, is that it's about we urge, we call, just the same rhetoric that we are now hearing with the Africa Climate Summit. And if you look at our statement as non-state actors that we released immediately after the declaration was read out, that point that you raised is actually one of the concerns that we actually had. That we did not see a clear roadmap from our heads of state. Of course, they did commission the African Union or request the African Union to actually come up with modalities on how this is going to be taken forward. But we needed to see our leaders being more decisive. We cannot just keep on saying, we appeal, we plead,
we request.
We need to have some clear, roadmap and action plan. That for sure, this is what we are requesting the northern government to do. And we are going to make a follow-up meeting, with them on this and this particular area, on this particular issue. I think we need to see some little bit, focus in terms of some roadmap, some clear action point in terms of how we move forward. Otherwise, this particular declaration will end up, joining all the other declarations that have been made, in various, convenings on climate change. And again, we are going to form yet another, trend, that will be happening after every 2 years, and we may not achieve, what we really want to achieve. So we need to see that, because heads of state coming together from almost the entire continent, that was a very, very massive, it was actually a massive force, that could have actually probably come up with some clear action points in terms of how we drive this process forward. Otherwise, they just told us the normal things that we've been hearing.
And of course, we have the African Union, the AU that brings together all the 54 states in Africa. And so the question is then, how do we move this conversation forward? How do we ensure that the outcomes that were captured out of the Nairobi Declaration, we develop an implementation mechanism. We develop a performance matrix. And of course, we ensure that countries commit as part of their budget, to fund specific projects, that will go towards dealing with climate change. Of course, we'll be continuing with this conversation going forward. But before now, I let you go because our time is well spent. In 30 seconds, I want to hear this from you. What should happen next now that the conference was held, the document is in place? What happens in 30 seconds?
Thank you so much. The declaration is there. At least we have several conferences coming up, one of them being United Nations General Assembly, where the President is, of course, attending, among other heads of state and other leaders. And he's already, of course, discussing that particular document. But most importantly, we have COP28 coming up, in Dubai.
Yeah.
And this document will form a very, very big, probably portion of the African position. So it's upon now the Africa group of negotiators, first and foremost, to look at this particular declaration and probably extract information that would actually be used to beef up, or to beef, this position that is going to be developed, for Africa, for COP. That is going to be very useful. So if we can make reference to that document and pick some of the critical issues to feed into a common African position, that would be good. The African Union has now the mandate, now to think about then how we push this forward. But most importantly, we have to strengthen our African Union. As it stands now, it's not even well resourced. The other thing is that I don't think it is even empowered enough to be able to actually, canvass a common African position and be able to move us where we need to be. So our African heads of state have a duty also to make sure they strengthen that institution. The Pan-African Parliament is an institution operating under the African Union, and I think that is a powerhouse that we can be able to use, in terms of especially domesticating some of the provisions of the declaration that have got to do with inward-looking, processes. And they're already discussing a model law. We facilitated a process here in Nairobi during the Africa Climate Summit, where Pan-African parliamentarians sat and they discussed, how they're going to progress in terms of coming up with a model climate law, which can actually be domesticated in the countries and which can actually be useful in ensuring that at least some of the commitment by African leaders that are actually inward-looking can actually be anchored in law to ensure that we're able to progress.
Very good. Charles Mwangi, thank you very much indeed. We'll continue to engage to see where this conversation takes us next. Otherwise, your time is highly appreciated. Asante sana.
Thank you so very much.
Very good. Charles Mwangi is the head of programs at the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, joining us this morning to help us break down the Nairobi Declaration on Climate Change and call for action. And of course, you have heard it from him. You're watching the Score Base Check. We are live from Broadcasting House. Our conversation next will be tracking the performance of the Kenyan economy. And so we'll be looking at the economic updates. Stay right here. Our guest is in the house.